Okay, so what is contained in these permits is a limitation on effluent. So, effluent, I don't know why I have a hard time explaining it, but it means flowing out. Okay, so something that flows out or forth, right? Effluence. So, if you have a wastewater pipe, flowing out of your house, that is effluence, right? So, they have stream flowing out of a lake, anything sewage treated into anything that flows out into something else is effluent. Okay. So, the permit establishes your effluent limitations, right? And has to be appropriate for the activity, right? The activity of the water quality, I mean, of the water, and they are enforceable. They're enforceable by the state and by the EPA. Okay, so your limits can either be technology based or based on those water quality standards with that total maximum daily load. Okay, and you can say, all right, well, you can emit this amount per day, this amount per week, this amount per month, this amount per year. Okay, all depends on the activity and the way the effluent um, is, is tailored for that particular facility. Okay, so we talked about those TMDLs, but the other one are these technology-based effluent limitations. Okay, so that is, it's not like an absolute amount, it's about what the permit holder has to do before discharging from the point source. Okay, so it depends on what you're discharging and your industrial category. Okay, so these are kind of, they don't make sense to me, but the highest one is this best available demonstrated technology. So best practicable, like what's the most practical, easiest way we can do it? That's BPT. Okay. Best conventional. So that is for conventional pollutants. Okay. Remember those? Those were, the nitrous oxide when we went back to pollutants, those categories there. Best available technology sounds a little better, right? Rather than best conventional technology. So those are for those other two categories of pollutants, toxic and non-conventional. Okay. And then best available demonstrated technology. That's a higher standard, and it is for toxic and non-conventional pollutants. In some areas, we need that BADT, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, now if your technology standard hasn't been set for a certain industrial category, the EPA uses what we call the best professional judgment, okay, BPJ. So they figure out, well, based on this new industrial category, which level of technology should be used. So it's called the BPJ. Okay, so they just kind of tell them, you know, it's a call based on their best professional judgment. Okay, so the water quality based effluent limitations, right? Those TMDLs or water quality, but that is a specific number, right? You can't discharge more than however many microns of a certain pollutant per gallon of water. Okay, now this is where this BADTCT comes in, this highest standard. They're called new source performance standards. Okay, so we have a permit. I've been polluting or I've been discharging under the permit for a while. Um, but now I want to create another factory, or I am going to have another piece of machinery that needs to discharge from a point source. Okay. New source. It's a new source. And because it would be a new factory, it would be a new facility, it would be a new piece of equipment, we can impose higher technology needs for this. Okay, so we have that highest standard of BADTCT, best available demonstrated control technology. Okay. So because of this, and this is, this always applies to every new source. When it's a technology based standard, it's got to be the best, the best of the best. It's like, um, it's got the ice maker with the with the crafts ice or whatever. When you look at when you're buying a refrigerator, there's all different levels of technology you can get. Um, so the highest one. So since is the highest one, it would be therefore, more expensive to put it on this new piece of equipment or this new facility. So sometimes, or a lot of times, the dischargers say, like, no, this isn't really a new source. It's just kind of a refurbished source, right? So that can be the subject of controversy, maybe litigation, um, as to whether this is a new source. So that's something, if you are working for a company and you are working on your clean water permit, you might be and there might be a new piece of equipment or something, you might be working with the attorneys in your department to challenge a new source categorization because you don't want that highest level of technology placed on it. Um, so a variance, so you're like, okay, you in this category are subject to this technology standard, and which you think is too high, and you might seek a variance. Just like when we were talking about zoning, right? Zoning, we want it different for me. I'm special. They are tough to get, but when you do get a variance, the most common type of a very rare reception of a variance is called the fundamentally different factor variance. Okay, so if the factors determining these technology based standards are different from what the factors considered when these effluent limitation guidelines came up, then maybe you get a variance. So they look to, what are you putting out there? What's the volume of discharge? So we're dealing with water impact, but are there any non-water environmental impacts? Maybe energy requirements for this technology. Maybe we need to like use so much fuel and energy, or there might be like a clean air uh, impact or something like that. So they look through all of those things to see if they can get this fundamentally different factor variance. Um, Permits also require not just the state, but the dischargers themselves to perform their own toxicity testing of the waters and what they're discharging, their effluent. And then again, it's tailored for each permit, like how often you have to do it, what specifically you have to test for. So sea and ocean discharges, sea and ocean discharges are usually not governed by the Clean Water Act. Um, you're really not supposed to discharge into the sea and the ocean. Now, if, we're talking about this, like, anti-degradate and anti-degradation policies. So if it's something that I guess it's minimal or whatever you're discharging is kind of no big deal, you might be able to get a permit to discharge into a sea or ocean. Um, but really not. I mean, it's kind of not, the Clean Water Act is not how this is done. There is a statute called the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, MPRSA. Um, and that statute provides that all you can dump into an ocean is like, dredged soil. So that's, not much, not much that you can dump into an ocean. Let me see where I am here. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to talk about are spills because you know what? They happen. Spills happen. And the Clean Water Act requires that facilities with these permits that they develop spill prevention, control, and countermeasure plans. So, God forbid something happens and there's a spill, they have to, prep for it. What do you have to do? What's the cleanup situation? What does who has to be notified? What can they do to fix it or limit it, or all of those things. Okay, so these plans, these SPCC plans, have to be updated, based on the permits, the situation, um, what they're discharging. They have to be certified by an engineer, and they have to be submitted and approved by the EPA. Okay, so, and if they're not, then they risk their permits being revoked. Anytime there is a spill, they have to report those spills to the National Response Center of the EPA to make sure that the EPA is aware of that. Um, Things that can be, kind of like permitted causes, like there's called like an upset cause. So the upset cause is like something happens, there's an earthquake, and then machine fails, or a power failure, or a flood or something like that. So that would be beyond the control of the operator. Now occasionally there is actually like an intentional bypass. So if there is a reason that maybe they have to flush a system, or there's maintenance, so that more has to be discharged than is usual, or than is required by their permit. They say that, the EPA says this is okay, or the Clean Water Act says it's okay if it's necessary, it's rare, and it's only necessary to avoid serious harm. Like, I got to bypass this because if I don't, the whole thing's going to blow, or something like that. So, if you're doing it that way, or that has occurred, you have to notify your permitting agency within 24 hours. Okay, so enforcement of Clean Water Act and the permits and all of that have typical enforcement type provisions for any kinds of administrative rules and regs. Um, you have things like civil penalties, criminal penalties. The state and the federal government are authorized to bring suit. I don't know. I don't think it's a citizen suit statute. And then the EPA can issue an administrative order to require compliance. They can issue administrative penalties like loss of a permit or fine. Um, Fines, impose injunctions. Now, when they're talking about just like the net limitations, if they're just monitoring and it's like, holy crap, there's a lot of lead in this water, they have to take into account the pollutants that were in the water before this permit holder discharged anything. Okay, let me get to the next one. So water intake is not controlled by the EPA. Okay, so think about it like, all right, I live on a lake, and I use the water from the lake to water my lawn. Okay, so that would goes back to like those riparian rights. But for waters of the United States, like, can a company or a person take the water, and if so, how much? So like a big thing, if I don't know if you know how these nuclear power facilities work, right? So the core gets very hot, and they have these like cooling lakes where they kind of intake and outtake water to cool. So there's like water that surrounds the core to keep it cool, and it's kind of like cycled so that the warm water goes out into the pool, and then as it's cooled, it goes back and cools that. Okay. Um, so you would need a permit to discharge the hot water or the warmer water back out into the lake. But the Clean Water Act does not really talk about the intake. So it's just something that'll be interesting. And TBD, stay tuned to see what happens about water intake. Okay, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about non-point sources again. Okay, so remember, non-point sources, you don't need an NPDES permit, but if you are, discharging into one of these POTWs, one of these, sewage systems, you have to, then you get a permit. Okay, so if my water or my stormwater is going through a sewer system, I have to do the permit requirements, which is that pre-treatment stuff, right? But like and this is when you read the book, most of our water pollution comes from non-point sources. So think about, like, okay, it rains and rain goes on the road, and then the road goes into the sewer system, and then the sewer system goes out, into, maybe it goes into the sewage treatment plant, or maybe it just runs off. Maybe it doesn't go into the sewer. Maybe it just runs off into land that then seeps into water, right? So that stuff isn't regulated, right? Because you have oils and toxic chemicals on land, right? Acid rain, right? So that's when rain clouds are kind of infected by chemicals that have been emitted into the air, and then the rain comes down, and then the rain is toxic. Um, any leakage from, say, a storage tank or something, that just like seeps, and then it gets into the groundwater, or eventually gets into a lake. I remember I used to have a lake house, and the fertilizers used on the for people, just for grass, then they would get into the lake, and then the lake would get like really bad, like algae blooms. So you were kind of prohibited from using certain fertilizers on your lawn. um, so anyway, it's really not, except for those stormwater that goes through the sewer systems with that pre-treatment permits, it's it's not regulated. And part of it is because, like, how do you do that? How do I regulate, things that seep into water, like from rain? So again, to be continued on that. Um, we were talking about things that can, go into the oceans, but this is about dredging and filling. So if I, have there's a canal or something like that, and you want to make it, deep enough for larger boats to go through, you might dredge it, right? You take material out from the body of water. And then again, that lake house that I had, because one of the things they did to improve these algae blooms was to dredge it out, right? Get all like the mucky junk from the floor of the lake and take it out so that it wouldn't, pollute it. Um, so that's dredging, right? You can picture what that is. And then there's fill. I'm using materials to fill in the water. So it's like, oh, I live on a lakefront. I want more lakefront. So I'm going to put a bunch of sand in by my waterfront, and then I get more water. Or I put a seawall there, right? It's basically, you're filling in the water. Okay, so if you want to do this to a water of the United States, remember, usually, like other, if it's a state type navigable water, you get you have to deal with state law. But for waters of the United States, you have to go to the Army Corps of Engineers to get a permit. And it's covered by Section 404A of the Clean Water Act, which protects wetlands, right? So you're limiting filling them in or dredging, right? If I have back to that Rampinos case, right? I have like a swampy area. I just want to put a bunch of soil on it so then I can farm it, or I can do something else with it, right? So that is filling or dredging. So we're trying to, I don't know if it's limiting or controlling, and seeing if it's done properly. That is Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. If the wetland is damaged somehow as a part of a project, there would be the permit holder would either have to mitigate that, like take it back, whatever they did, or somehow pay a fee in lieu of mitigation that goes to the protection of wetlands. So I'm gonna this part of the lecture is gonna be over. I had I think 12, maybe 11. 4 and 3 would be the review questions to deal with before you go to the next lecture, and I'll write that down in the module. All right, talk to you in a bit.